Ópera apresenta ExpoGestão.
Good morning, bom dia. I would like to share with you today some thoughts and some experiences that I have on something that you must find dear to your hearts, making the company that you work for better and more successful. It doesn't matter what your position is in the company, you all have a responsibility to get involved and to do whatever you need to do to get you to the next level, as Art Willem on the video was saying. So we talk about continuous improvement. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about today, the planning process in generating the targets for next year, the improvements you need to have, some of the metrics that we use, and then the most important component of getting better, leadership. Most of you, I think, have leadership roles in your companies, and your contribution to that process is not one of delegation. It's one of getting involved, of leading your team, and finding out what you need to do to make your company more successful. And lastly, and that's probably a good segue into the questions at the end, what can you do differently tomorrow? It's great to hear a presentation at 100,000 foot level, but let's talk about practicalities and what you can do when you go back to your companies tomorrow. At GE, the business planning process was twofold. We had a strategic planning session. We looked at a 3 to 5 year horizon. We analyzed our competitors. We decided what the markets were requiring of us, and generally put a plan together for what we felt we would need in the coming years. So that was the strategic level. Then there was the tactical level, which was a business plan targets for next year. They flow down from the business level to the functional level, and you have both financial and operational targets. And there's always a gap analysis for the difference between where you are today and what the plan requires you to be. Now at GE, Jack had a famous saying, and you may have heard it: control your own destiny before someone does it for you. He hated people who came with targets like a 1.2% increase. He goes, really? Does that make a difference? He wanted 5, 6, 7% increases. Make a difference, because if you don't, that's what's going to happen to you. So he was always about stretch targets. In the tactical planning, you start off with last year's actual. So I have here an example. $100 million of operating margin prior year, and the target for this year is 110. So somehow we have to generate $10 million more of operating margin. That's the goal. If we take that and divide it up, we used to do it like this. We divided that up into 4 categories. Number 1 was price. The team felt that in the coming year, we were going to lose $5 million on price. That's, with all of our plans for price in place, we were still going to lose $5 million. The next component was volume. Here we felt we could sell more, and we could probably get an extra $4 million from additional sales. Then you have the bucket that I personally hated, called product mix. Product mix is the mix of high margin and low margin products that you sell. In this example, they were predicting a minus $11 million in product mix. So we were going to sell much more of the low margin and much less of the high margin, and that was going to have a minus $11 million effect on our profits. So here I am with these buckets, and I'm already $12 million in the hole. And I got to get to plus 10. So you have this fourth bucket called productivity, which is just going to be $22 million, because that's what I need to make the target. Now, no one has any clue how to get to $22 million of productivity, but it's in the plan, because that's what the plan is. We call this the financial walk. It's basically the walk from prior year through to current year plan. That's how you get there. That's what you need to execute in the coming 12 months. Now, the organization has a view of this. Number one, price is primarily controlled by the market. Yeah, there are some niches where maybe we do have more control, but basically it's a market-driven thing. You can get additional volume, but it's almost certainly going to cost you in price. Product mix is all market-driven. And on the productivity, we've already taken out all the excess costs we possibly could. So this is a pretty positive story, right? You have no control, and we've taken all the cost out that we can think of. So how do we make this business plan then a reality, given that scenario? Well, a couple of points before we get into that. This is a tops-down plan. This is not bottoms-up. This is what we believe the market requires us to do. The price and volume include all the identified opportunities that we have. So we've already added that to what the core business is going to do. The product mix is a forecast. Generally optimistic, generally is worse than what the plan says. And the productivity is a plug. It is just the math to make it work. Given this, most businesses I've been in, they go, okay, we will take the plan and we will simply roll that down into the functions. So everybody gets a piece of this pie and they can make their plans to make this happen. Sound familiar? That's how most of these processes work. Now, I think there are two ways to go at this. You can do the functional approach, where we simply divide up the business goals into functional goals. Here's what generally happens. Number one, there is little investigation. It immediately gets to action plans. So, not always the right action plans. There is a functional focus, and a real danger that you will get business risk. We will start to save cost and impact other business parameters. Think of maintenance. If I decide to reduce maintenance cost, that's fantastic, providing the maintenance level stays the same. If I reduce maintenance costs by reducing my spare parts inventory and my plant loses hours of production, that's not going to help. So there is this functional focus and a business risk. I think the functional approach will target infrastructure and service, which maybe in the short term is not that bad a thing. You can manage a little less infrastructure and maybe a little less service for a year, but if you do that year after year after year, slowly you are dismantling your company. It's not a smart thing to do to a business that wants to succeed. So I think the infrastructure is a problem. The add-on activities of finding cost savings are all additional. They compete with your normal job, and they really don't necessarily get the priority they need. Bottom line, I think cost reduction is the goal, and process performance is simply a consequence of your cost reduction plans. I think that is totally the wrong way around, but we'll come to that in a minute. And lastly, it's very difficult to sustain in the long term, from an ideas perspective and from a motivation perspective. If you've been through this cost-cutting exercise quarter after quarter after quarter, it's hard to find work exciting. It is really a hard grind. So that's the functional approach. We basically revisit the usual suspects. I mentioned maintenance costs, but I'm sure you've got a whole list of stuff that you go after. The process approach is a little different. It says the $22 million means I have to find a better way to do what I do today. And I have business processes that do that. If I look at it from a process perspective, can I find opportunities in my business processes to do it better and reduce the cost? So it certainly needs planning. It requires cross-functional teams. The process improvement is the goal. Cost reduction is a consequence. That is a much more thought out, more likely to succeed approach than cutting costs and hoping that you don't damage the business. And it is much more sustainable through process management. So I'm a real fan of the process approach. I've seen it work, and it really is a much better way of doing this. Cost is simply a function of what you do. And if you do it differently, you will change the cost. An example of that, out of manufacturing, you have a core production process in your facility, and you have a whole load of KPIs or key process indicators that measure the performance. There they are. And we generally go after these as part of our cost-cutting exercise. But if you look at your core process, that's what it is. This is the output of the plant day by day by day by day. And you can see in this plant, there's a lot of variation. The reason why all those KPIs are there is because of that process. If you want to change the KPI values, change the process. Go after your core production process because that's what generates cost. Personal experience, I've worked on product quality. I've had projects on project quality, trying to make the quality better in that process without touching the process. It's not going to work. On the other hand, if you go after the output there and you take out that variation, I can guarantee you your quality and your cost will go down without any projects whatsoever. It's all about your core process. So I'm into process improvement, a way to, basically, as Jack would say, I want to find a better way every day of running my business. What do you need to implement that? A couple of things. You need effective methodologies and you need toolkits. That's certainly necessary, but it's nowhere close to sufficient. Do not believe that you can have toolkits, put them in your organization, delegate it down, and I'm done. Toolkits will not solve your problem on their own. You need some other stuff. Number one, you need data-driven analysis. I think that's getting better in business, but it's no longer acceptable to have opinions. You need some data, you need some analysis to show which way to go. You need change management techniques. You have to have a way of handling the problems that are caused by change. You need a way of learning in an organization. A lot of the problems today, we don't know how to solve. We need to learn a better way of doing it. You have to find a way of how does an organization learn? It doesn't happen on its own. You need dedicated project leaders. You need people who are smart, motivated, passionate to lead some of these projects. And lastly, you need informed, engaged, and passionate leaders who will get involved. I'm going to talk about that one. I could talk about them all, but there's nowhere near enough time, so let me spend the rest of this presentation talking about leaders. It's always a critical success factor. Now, my experience in talking to people who have led change, in businesses that have had successful change and businesses that have had less than successful change, there are three characteristics, I think, of a manager who drives change in his organization. Number one, these people find that making their company better is more important than their functional goals. That's a big deal. And there are not that many managers who think that. But if you're driving your functional goals, you will sub-optimize. You will do things that drive your functional metrics and maybe hurt the business. You have to find that making the company better is more important. Number two, you have to be dissatisfied with the status quo. You can't come to work and feel, let's just do what we did yesterday. Not good enough. You have to want to drive to a higher level. And number three, you have to invite the people who work for you to challenge your ideas, your beliefs. Because there's a good chance that where your company is today is based on what you as a leader believe. Now, if you've got it all right, that's fine. But if some of your beliefs are not right, how would you ever know that? Very important. I'm going to come back to this paradigm problem in a couple of minutes. So let's look at some examples of these three characteristics and the effect they have. The first example I have is an interesting one, and it's become quite famous. It's basically called the wing-to-wing example. It's about FedEx and their fleet of aircraft, and they take their packages around the world. And obviously these planes that they use have to be serviced occasionally, and particularly the engines have to be serviced. And GE was the company that serviced these engines. Now, when an engine needs servicing, the plane obviously lands. They take the engine off the plane. They take it to a service center. It gets serviced, and then eventually it goes out and back to FedEx. The problem that FedEx had was they had spare engines to be able to do this, but that inventory of spare engines was very low, and they were worried, I'm going to have planes on the ground without engines. And that is unacceptable for FedEx. So, potential business problem for FedEx, and obviously a potential business problem for GE, who clearly could not let FedEx be without engines. So the solution, we needed to make a faster service on these engines. The time had to go down, and it was basically a lean project, which was great. So here's the process, the plane, the engine comes off the plane, through the overhaul shop, and back on the plane. Okay, let me explain this graph to you. On the left-hand axis, you have the cycle time in days. You can see that when we started, it was 80 days. And then over the next 9 months, it went from 80 days down to 37 days. Now, for those of you that actually fly, I need to tell you that none of the stuff that they did in any way impacted the technical service of the engine. They were not allowed to miss out steps, in other words. All of the changes they made were to the logistics and the organization around that servicing. So the service itself was not impacted. But that's a pretty impressive performance improvement from 80 to 37. And GE were really proud of that. So they went to talk to FedEx and have a celebration. FedEx was less than impressed. FedEx said, let me show you what we measure. And you can see there what FedEx measured. Here, their number went down from 144 to about 140. So what do you think GE said when FedEx put this graph up? It's hard to explain, right? I mean, it's not like it's 1 or 2 days different. It's 60 whatever days different. Well, I need to show you another graph. If this is the process, FedEx were responsible for taking the engine off the plane and bringing it to the GE shop. GE responsible, obviously, for the service, and then FedEx responsible to getting it back on the plane. So, of course, the GE guy said, dumb customer. It's not my fault. Because you can only measure me on the part that I control. That part that goes from 80 to 37. And so FedEx said, you know what? If we have engines on the ground, planes on the ground that have no engine, who do you think we blame? It isn't FedEx. So get involved. The guy who ran the company actually had a different view. He was saying, you know what? I just never knew FedEx measured it this way. I'd never seen the FedEx measurements before. And if you look at that area on the graph, that's a huge opportunity to delight the customer that I just never knew existed. So what he decided was he was going to forget the bottom line, and I'm going to measure the top line. To which a lot of people in GE said, you're crazy. I mean, why would you do that? That's stupid. We don't control that. And he said, I don't care. Ultimately, that's how we get measured by our customer. So he went away, he went back, and he enforced what he wanted to do of making people accountable for that top line. Let me show you what happened. In about 5 weeks, that top line went from 140 to 60. Only because he changed the measurement. Only because he had a different way of going at this problem. Now, what do you think happened to make that huge drop in that FedEx measurement? I'll give you one. There were a number, but I'll give you one. When this engine goes through these shops, the shop and where the plane is are not at the same location. The shop could be in Sao Paulo, and the plane can be in Nebraska in America. How long do you think it takes to arrange transport for an engine from Sao Paulo to the middle of nowhere in the US? It's got to be 2 or 3 weeks to arrange this transport. So we said to the guy, when do you actually tell FedEx that you need that they need to arrange transport? And he said, well, when the engine's ready to go. Because he got measured on the bottom line. He didn't care how long it took for the transport because that was outside his scope. As soon as he got measured on the top line, now it did matter. So he was on the phone to FedEx 3 weeks before that engine was finished, saying, you had better get the transport here the moment that we finish the engine. It's simple, right? You're just driven by what you are measured on what the process is that you are getting appraised on. That happened so fast because all they did was change the way they looked at the problem. So now FedEx loved this. I mean, they just could not believe the number of spare engines that were so suddenly available. It was phenomenal. They bought new planes, and they didn't have to buy any spare engines because they had so many now. Huge deal. Huge deal. So this is about making the company better. Forget the functional measurements. The bottom line, it's great. Let's look at the top line. You know, we have something called the outside in, which is it's pretty interesting. If you look at your business, your plan, whatever it is, as a black box, we always want to talk about inside the black box. We always want to measure inside the box. If you actually look at the outside metric, it's amazing how much different it looks. Look at it the way the customers, your stakeholders look at it. Because ultimately, if you look at point 3 there, the outcomes are judged basically independently by your customers against their targets and their expectations. So you're having a party in the box, and they're crying on the outside at what's coming out. It's just a big, You can't have that mismatch. Look at it from the perspective of your customers. Okay. Whoops. Dissatisfied with the status quo. Very important. I went to a company out in California, and they showed me this graph. This is their performance over a period of 15 months, and the red line is their average production over that period. So they make 5,712 whatever a day. And the guy was saying, I'm out of capacity. My plant is running basically at its maximum, and I'm going to put in a capital request for money to actually put bigger equipment in to make more. And I said, yeah, that's pretty interesting. Do you have the data that you use for that curve? And so he gave me the data. So I made a couple of different graphs. First of all, I took the data and I said, let's look at it on a weekly basis. That's what that data looked like on a weekly basis. Same period, same 15 months. And you can see there are some weeks where he made 8,000, and some weeks where he had a hard time making 4,000. But the 8,000 says, was he really out of capacity? Do you think that he could have actually got more out of the plant than he said? So that was on a weekly basis. Then I said, well, let's look at it on a daily basis. Let's look at what the actual daily output is. That's what the actual daily looked like. If you look at that, at the top points there are 10,000 units a day. Do you really think his capacity is 6,000? His average output is 6,000, but a huge amount of variation. Now, almost every company I go to has that type of graph. It's amazing. So I thought I'd challenge him with the following. Here are the two graphs that you showed me. The monthly graph and the daily reality. Same data, just a different reality. Let me ask you some questions. Which of those two graphs do you think shows better how your customers feel about you? Now, of course, you have inventory, so some of that variation will be dampened by inventory, but still, some of that variation is going to reach your customers. So I think the right-hand graph shows better what your customers feel. Which of the graph reflects better the level of employee stress in your company? Right one. It's not a difficult question. And lastly, and probably most important, which of the two do you think shows the better improvement opportunities? The right one. So, of these two graphs, the right one has far more information that could help you as a leader. Then my last and final question is, which one do you send to your boss? Yeah, I send the left one. Why do you do that? Why do you send the one that has no information to your boss? Well, two reasons. One, I want to keep my job. I'm worried that my boss will use that for my appraisal, and it will not be a good appraisal. But secondly, I do it because if I show him that, he's going to expect I do something about it. And I don't want to do anything about it. I quite like the status quo. That status quo is not good. But you'd be surprised the number of people who said, Peter, could you take that graph on the right there and please put it in your bottom left-hand drawer and never ever take it out again? I do not want to share that. Paradigms. Paradigms, I'm not sure what the Portuguese is for paradigms, but paradigms are beliefs, things that you believe to be true. They are the noble certainties of life. They are things that we just know that that's the way that God created it. They dictate the way we look at life. They determine the solution to our problems. We know we have these restrictions, and so we will have solutions that are based on these restrictions we have. They fix the operating boundaries. We can't go outside what we believe. Paradigms are real. They are usually not validated with any data because they are so obvious and they are long-standing. And the majority of paradigms are probably true. Probably true. But what about the paradigms that are not true? What about the things that we believe that are not true? Doesn't happen, right? I mean, everything we believe is true. You know, I tried once to tell my boss something that he believed I didn't think was right. It was a very short conversation. I mean, if your boss believes something and you have a conversation with him about how that's not true, it can quickly turn into a career-limiting discussion. You do not want to do that. So, challenging my paradigms, here's a 4-block. On the left-hand side, you have what the data says. At the top, if it's important. If the bottom, it's not important. And on the bottom axis, you have what I believe it's important or not important. Now, there are 2 blocks here in blue where I and the data agree, and there are 2 blocks where I don't agree. So if you look at how you or me or a manager will react to this, when we both agree it's important, it's obvious. I knew that already. So let's accelerate. It's obvious. When both I and the data says it's not important, that's not a surprise either. I knew that. It's irrelevant. So make sure no one's working on it. That's great too. Where we don't agree, the data says this is important and I don't think it's important, or I have never thought it was important. The reaction is, that is surprising. Are you sure that's right? The bottom left is the biggest problem. This is where the data says, it's not important, and I think it's the most important thing around. The reaction is, I can't believe that, you're wrong. That's what people say. You're just wrong. We have something that's called the 3 stages of denial. So with this 4-block in mind, if you come in the bottom left, the first stage of denial is called the show me more data. So what you hear is, the data is not representative of what we're looking at. I need some more data. You obviously haven't got enough data yet to show what I think you should show. Of course, what he's really saying is, give me more data that shows I'm right. The second stage of denial is the one that's called, we're using the wrong metric. So I believe the data, but we're just not looking at it the right way. So the data may be correct, we're looking at it wrongly. What he really means is, let's define a better metric that shows I'm right. That's the second stage of denial. And thirdly, we need a new improvement leader. So what he's really saying is, Paolo's doing a great job, we should give him more responsibility elsewhere. I think, get me someone else who knows I'm right. This is a little light-hearted look at this problem. And when I present this to managers like yourselves, we all laugh about it and say it's really funny. The next slide, I put up their data, or your data, and the reaction is always, the data's wrong. Always. So let me show you an example of that. Another famous daily graph. This data comes from a grain terminal in Vancouver. They bring grain in from Canada in rail cars to Vancouver Harbour, and it's there loaded into ships. This graph is the number of rail cars they unload a day. And you can see there the average is 112, but there's a lot of variation. And the guy who ran the terminal said, yeah, that's good, Peter, but there's only one reason why it looks like that. And so I said, what was that? He said, well, the railroad just don't bring in enough rail cars. sometimes we're just waiting with no rail cars to unload. And that's why you get that daily variation. I said, you know, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Do you have any data on that? He says, of course, because we talk monthly with the railroad, and we take the data and we try to encourage the railroad to perform better. And it's nationalized in Canada, so it's not easy. Like, okay, so give me the data. So he gave me the data, and I plotted this graph. Now, again, what this graph says, on the left-hand side are the number of rail cars unloaded per day, and on the bottom axis, the number of minutes delayed because there were no cars. And the graph says, it absolutely makes no difference. You can have 160 cars on 0 delay, and you can have 160 cars on 600 minutes delay. There is no correlation in the data. What do you think he said? Show me more data. The data's wrong. To which I would say, it's your data. It's not my data. It's your data. What's wrong with that picture? So I went away and I did some more analysis and came back with this graph. The red line is what you would expect the output of his terminal to be based on the number of delay minutes. And you can see that all the points are under that line. The red points are the ones that are at the line. So on those days, out of rail cars was the only reason why he unloaded less. Most of the days, the blue dots are below the line. There was something else other than rail cars that impacted the output. It turns out that 25% of the variation is out of cars. So, of course, he was right. The railroad is a problem. He just believed it was 100% of the problem and felt there's nothing I can do about it. This says, if you can get away from that paradigm, 75% of the delays have nothing to do with the rail cars being available at all. Get over what you believe, let's move on and start to improve the business. But you have to confront that paradigm first. He believed it so passionately, it stopped every single idea he had about making things better. I guess it's natural for people always to blame the external factors for problems they have. It's the raw material quality. It's whatever. But the data can show you exactly what the opportunity is and exactly how to go after this. I was telling you that there are not many people that have all three characteristics. This is a rough estimate of what I think it is. If you start off with 100% of the managers, and you apply the first one of making the company better, probably 30% of the managers are remaining. If you then add rejecting the status quo as acceptable, the 30% probably goes down to 15. And if you're looking for managers who actively try and disprove their beliefs, the 15 is probably 5. So that's the problem. Future leaders that you want to drive change in your business need a different DNA. They're good managers, but if you want them to go to the next level, they need to think about this problem differently. We're going to get back to something that was on an earlier slide that I didn't really talk about. For people that you choose in your company to drive this business improvement effort, I would always choose your future leaders. If you can train them now, if you can give them the experience now on how to do this, when they become leaders, they will act completely differently to the way that your existing leaders operate. You know, it was, to a GE example, I think we had been doing Six Sigma in GE for probably 5 or 6 years. And Welch said, I think it's really going well. And I mean, you don't want to argue with Jack, but we said, well, in a lot of ways it is going well, but there's one way that it's not going as well as it needs to go, and that's in the number of executives we have that have actually done Six Sigma. Because the number of executives who have Six Sigma experience is 0.000001%. And if you want to change the company, Jack, it's going to take about 150 years at this rate. You've got to do something to get your leadership this experience in how to change the paradigms. So he did change it. There was not an easy process, but he changed it. He put in a rule that said, okay, to be an executive, you have to have had Six Sigma operational experience. You must have had it. You can't be an executive if you haven't. Oh, you can't imagine what the company thought about that. I mean, that was a huge mandate for people. I mean, I can't be an executive? People have been telling me my whole career that I'm on the track to be an executive, and now Jack puts this extra hurdle in. So suddenly, all the people in Six Sigma changed. They were now all future leaders in this Six Sigma, because that's the only way they could become executives. You can't imagine the energy that came into GE at that point in time. There were passionate people driving projects. We had a $2 billion margin improvement the year after this happened. Unbelievable. Just because Jack had said, that's what I want. In the 3 or 4 years that he gave us to do this, I think in the end it got up to about 25%. But significant number of people in the executive band were Six Sigma alumni, to the extent that the people who were executives who were already there got real nervous because they had these new colleagues who had Six Sigma experience, and they were afraid that they would actually beat them to any senior executive positions. It's a big deal. This DNA is a problem, and that's what I think you guys need to address. I think that there are two sides to improvement. There's the intellectual capacity to understand the changes that you need. I don't think for most people that's a problem. It's not difficult to understand. There are methodologies, you just follow the rules, it's fine. The other thing is the passion to go out there and make it happen. That's where the problem is. So we talked about the 3 characteristics, but it really is all about passion. It's about the belief in making your company better. It's a conviction that says, I am never going to be satisfied with the status quo. It's the self-confidence to challenge the current beliefs and find a better way. And lastly, it's this passionate commitment that I am going to help my organization learn, and I am going to deliver significant business impact by making every day a better way to do our work. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions, so let's open up for questions.
Ópera apresenta ExpoGestão.